University of Illinois College of Medicine Rockford's Merit Program, which provides essential services to survivors of childhood abuse and neglect, announces a plan to enhance collaboration with an area nonprofit with a similar mission. So starting in 2027, Merit will co-locate with the Family Peace Center, which leaders with the nonprofit say is a move that will help strengthen local strategy to decrease community violence.
The Rockford Family Peace Center and Merit, as part of the University of Illinois College of Medicine, really have intricately tied missions that we serve those individuals who have been abused. If it's a survivor of domestic violence or if it's a survivor of child abuse. And to have these co-located, make sure that not only will they just get services from their individual organizations, but from the more than 30 other partner organizations under one roof.